The transformation of the modern state has often been described in terms of laws, parties, or ideologies, yet beneath those categories lies a quieter and more tangible process, the spatial and procedural convergence of administration and armed force. It is in corridors, courtyards, and offices, not merely in decrees, that authority changes shape. The story of Nazi Germany renders this process with unmatched clarity. Between 1933 and 1939, the German governmental corps reconstituted itself as an organism in which civil administration, military command, and security justification became indistinguishable. What appeared as emergency prudence or architectural modernization gradually formed a compound, a campus of fused functions, whose stability depended on the inseparability of its parts. The first gestures of this convergence seemed banal. A decree drafted in haste, a parliament moved to a temporary venue, protective police stationed in ministerial halls. Each was rationalized as necessity. Yet, together, they initiated a confidence operation, an incremental persuasion that extraordinary measures were both practical and inevitable. This was not overt seizure, but the recoding of space and legitimacy. The administrative state learned to live inside the architecture and language of defense, and by doing so, it ceased to distinguish itself from it. Our analysis begins by tracing this emergence through the confidence pattern, the inaugural triad of the compound's evolution. From the Reichstag fire of February 1933 to the executive reorganization of 1938, the German case shows how a series of pragmatic adjustments accumulated into a total realignment of command. What began as security precaution matured into architectural doctrine, producing the spatial and psychological template for militarized governance. The fusion of administration and defense did not begin with a blueprint, but with an emergency. The convergence first appeared not as ideology but as improvisation, a chain of practical responses that turned contingency into doctrine. On the night of February 27, 1933, the Reichstag burned. Within hours, the event was framed as a communist insurrection, the foundational myth of emergency. The Reichstag fire decree of the next day suspended civil liberties and transferred police powers from states to the central government. It was presented as protection, the state defending itself from subversion. In truth, it was the cell, the psychological opening through which the civil sphere accepted military logic as its own. What vanished in 1933 was not the rule of law, but its orientation. Procedure no longer limited power, but secured it. Spatially, the Reichstag's ruin offered opportunity. Parliament relocated to the Kroll Opera House, a venue already under heavy police supervision. What was called a temporary accommodation resituated governance within a securitized shell. The stage, balconies, and ceremonial lighting turned deliberation into performance. The legislative body now met inside an enclosure designed for choreography, not debate. The setting naturalized the surveillance of government and began the long migration of authority into controlled space. On March 23, 1933, in that same opera house, the Enabling Act passed under intimidation by armed guards. Legislative authority shifted to the cabinet, ostensibly for efficiency during crisis. The triadic chain was complete. The emergency decree and spatial relocation generated normalized supervisory presence, which produced authority leverage in lawmaking by decree. And conversely, without the initial act, without the performative fire and the security rationale, the final consolidation was improbable. The causal triad had been realized in statecraft. Normalization arrived through daily routine. In 1933-34, the security organs, political police, Gestapo, and the party's SD, were merged under central command. Their offices clustered along Prince Albrechtstrasse, within a short walk of the Chancellery. Uniformed presence became standard in ministries, Adjutants from the army consulted continually with civilian officials. Telephones linked the chancellery directly to police headquarters. What had been temporary coordination evolved into structural adjacency. The spatial effect was subtle but decisive. Administration began to inhabit the rhythms of command. Guarded entries, coded corridors, shared mess halls. The government operated in what it imagined as a fortress under siege. Parliament remained in the Opera House, still temporary, still guarded. The temporary had become the texture of normal life. Supervisory presence was now indistinguishable from governance itself. By 1938, the compound logic was explicit. The Blomberg-Fritsch affair allowed Hitler to purge the army's high command, dissolve resistance, and create the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, directly under his authority. Command was now a residential function, centered in the chancellery complex rather than the general staff. Civilian leadership did not merely supervise the military, it subsumed it through architecture and routine. The building itself became instrument. In January 1938, Hitler commissioned Albert Speer's new Reich Chancellery, completed a year later. Its sequence of colossal halls and windowless galleries turned spatial movement into ritual submission. Visitors advanced along axial corridors that lengthened perception and isolated the center, each threshold reinforcing hierarchy. Architecture became a technology of command, the physical equivalent of decree. The marble corridors that linked offices, apartments, and audience halls materialized the authority gradient that had begun 5 years earlier in the Opera House. Thus, the confidence pattern closed its loop. Cell, the emergency narrative establishes trust in extraordinary protection. Normalize, constant supervision makes military presence ordinary. Exploit, proximity enables command capture. From fire to facade, each stage appeared rational, even prudent. Together they transformed a republic into an admino-military organism, whose confidence derived from its own enclosure. What began as protection of governance had become governance as protection, the founding paradox of the modern compound. Every compound begins with a story of necessity. A crisis, whether real or manufactured, allows leaders to portray exceptional measures as prudent stewardship. The first concession is usually procedural: temporary suspension of norms, relocation to a secure venue, or the creation of an extraordinary coordinating office. These gestures seem administrative, not revolutionary. Yet each embeds the assumption that legality and safety are incompatible. The warning is clear. Once fear becomes the measure of legitimacy, the civic sphere invites its own containment. No institution is ever safer than when it is unnecessary, and none is more dangerous than when it believes its survival requires permanent protection. The confidence gained through protection demanded permanence. What had begun as emergency coordination now sought institutional form, drawing the civilian apparatus into the orbit of command. By the mid-1930s, what had begun as a functional overlap between the civilian and military sectors evolved into a system of mutual reinforcement, a loop of necessity in which each justification regenerated the next. The German case renders this dynamic with remarkable precision. The administrative elite, once dependent upon the army for security and prestige, began to occupy its spaces and its idiom, until the two were indistinguishable in both personnel and architecture. The earliest phase of integration was characterized by the embedding of party and police representatives within state ministries and military departments. What began as coordination soon hardened into structural penetration. Political commissioners attended army meetings. Liaison offices appeared between the Reich ministries and the newly consolidated security police. Within the Chancellery itself, uniformed adjutants from the Wehrmacht stood beside bureaucrats in meetings, managing communications and enforcing the will of the Führer. in this configuration, administrative neutrality evaporated. Each ministry acquired its security counterpart. The Ministry of the Interior, shadowed by the Gestapo. The Ministry of Propaganda, paired with the SD. The Chancellery itself, guarded and staffed by officers. The functional premise was always the same: defense of the state. Yet this defense required that the state internalize military logic. Political supervision was no longer external oversight, but an ambient condition of work. The blending of roles required an ideological binder. The regime provided it in the doctrine of unity: Volk, Partei, Wehrmacht, one will, one mission. The propaganda apparatus translated bureaucratic fusion into national destiny. Ceremonies, films and architecture all repeated the theme of coordination, Gleichschaltung, celebrating the erasure of institutional divides as proof of moral strength. By 1936–37, this myth had achieved doctrinal status. The notion that politics and the military should remain separate was dismissed as decadence. The armed forces, once cautious of party interference, now portrayed obedience as patriotism. The administrative penetration of the military thus produced not resistance, but affirmation. The hierarchy of command was recoded as a hierarchy of faith. Once this unity narrative was accepted, it legitimized even greater civilian intrusion. Appointments in the army now required party approval. Political reliability outweighed competence. The army purges of 1938, precipitated by the Blomberg-Fritsch crisis, completed this transformation. With the generals discredited, the newly created OKW placed all operational chains directly beneath Hitler's personal staff. Civilian and military authority became identical, their offices adjacent within the Chancellery complex. The loop closed, justification feeding integration, integration generating further justification. This reinforcement triad yielded a system that reproduced itself. Every security rationale demanded more coordination. Every act of coordination confirmed the need for the initial rationale. The logic was not hierarchical, but recursive, and its material expression was the Berlin government quarter itself, where ministries, barracks, and party offices formed a single administrative grid of obedience. When the civilian and the military share space, they soon share purpose. Integration that begins as coordination becomes symbiosis, and the logic of one infects the other. Bureaucracy learns hierarchy. Hierarchy adopts bureaucracy's procedural permanence. What results is not tyranny in the old sense, but self-referential governance, a regime that acts to maintain its own coherence rather than to serve a public. Modern administrations face this temptation whenever security expertise infiltrates decision-making to the point that dissent equals disloyalty. The warning is not against cooperation, but against the loss of friction. A system without internal resistance ceases to deliberate. It only amplifies. Integration seeks expression. Once hierarchy was accepted as virtue, stone and steel became its grammar. Power sought to make itself visible, but in doing so, it also learned to hide. The monumental projects of the late 1930s, the new Reich Chancellery, the Air Ministry, the expanding police complexes, created a new kind of space, one that combined spectacle and seclusion. The executive was no longer a set of offices, it became a territory, a fortified organism whose walls produced legitimacy. When Hitler commissioned Albert Speer in January 1938 to design a new chancellery, he demanded a structure that could embody the authority of 1,000 years. The result was more than a headquarters. With its kilometer-long marble gallery, its enormous courtyards and windowless corridors, the building transformed the concept of access. To reach the Führer's office, visitors passed through a sequence of escalating thresholds. each longer, colder, and more silent than the last. Distance itself became a political language, authority measured in meters of marble. The Chancellery's expansion paralleled the growth of the surrounding district. The Air Ministry, completed 2 years earlier, stretched for more than 250 meters, anchoring the southern flank of the campus. The RSHA and Gestapo headquarters rose nearby, integrating police and intelligence functions. What had begun as separate sites, administrative, military, and security, were now contiguous, forming a dense architectural field of command. Spatial growth quickly translated into symbolic dominance. The Chancellery's courtyards were guarded, its windows shielded, its entrances restricted. The building's enclosure turned isolation into proof of sovereignty. The fewer the people admitted, the greater the authority presumed within. Ministers entered by ritual, officers approached as petitioners. Architecture replaced deliberation with choreography. In this world, to approach power was to traverse a designed experience of subordination. The logic extended underground. In 1936, the Vorbunker was constructed beneath the Chancellery garden, a precaution disguised as convenience. By 1944, it had deepened into the Führerbunker, an autonomous fortress connecting residence, command, and siege shelter in one subterranean complex. Physical insulation mirrored political insulation. The state no longer occupied Berlin, it burrowed beneath it. Each expansion justified the next. Security concerns demanded enclosure. Enclosure produced grandeur. Grandeur reinforced the need for further security. The Triads' non-linearity lay precisely here. The cause and effect exchanged places, forming an upward spiral of self-legitimation. What began as protection of the executive became the executive's raison d'être. The Chancellery's immense corridors, its private bunkers and its guarded plazas embodied the logic of the non-linear triad. Expansion feeding insulation. Insulation validating expansion. The spatial consequence was the erasure of civic permeability. The government quarter ceased to be part of the city. It was a walled nervous system, self-contained, self-justifying, and spatially absolute. The physical fabric of Berlin began to reflect the metaphysics of command. The lesson here lies in physical form. Power seeks distance. What begins as a security perimeter becomes an ideology of enclosure. The executive's fortification, its sealed corridors and invisible command centers, translate authority into geometry. Once governance requires a buffer between ruler and ruled, that buffer becomes the real seat of power. Every modern capital risks this when it allows the architecture of control, walls, surveillance grids, restricted zones, to define the architecture of law. The true meaning of a government building is not how it looks, but how many thresholds a citizen must cross to be heard within it. As the executive core enclosed itself, the military exterior expanded outward. The streets of Berlin, once civic, became ceremonial avenues of mobilization. The martial presence that had begun as protection of government turned into a general condition of public life. In this retrospective triad, the cause appeared to follow its effect. The deployment of troops proved the need for their own deployment. Throughout the mid-1930s, the visual language of the regime changed. Parades, flag rituals, and mass drills no longer marked exceptional events. They defined everyday order. The SA and SS, once party militias, became fixtures of the urban landscape. By 1936, police, army, and paramilitary units patrolled Berlin in seamless rotation. The display of force was itself a form of governance. The architectural geography of coercion solidified this normalization. The RSHA and Gestapo complexes on Prince Albrechtstrasse, the Chancellery, and the Air Ministry lay within a few hundred meters of each other, forming what might be called the triangle of control. Surveillance, detention, and administration occupied the same urban tissue. The proximity rendered violence bureaucratic and bureaucracy violent. As external legitimacy declined through repression, censorship, and the silencing of opposition, civilian oversight eroded. The parliament, still housed in the opera house, no longer legislated. It performed. The courts enforced decrees rather than interpreted law. In this vacuum, military and police actors became the sole interpreters of necessity. The boundary between governance and security dissolved completely. By the late 1930s, the regime's emergency apparatus had become its permanent form. Each crisis validated the architecture built to contain it. The existence of bunkers, guards, and checkpoints demonstrated that danger persisted. Their persistence, in turn, confirmed the righteousness of authoritarian control. This is the heart of the retrospective loop. The system's justifications become its own evidence. The population no longer remembered a time when government did not wear a uniform. The retrospective pattern teaches that once emergency governance becomes habit, it cannot declare peace. The existence of control measures proves their necessity. A state accustomed to ruling through alerts, readiness levels, or indefinite authorizations will not relinquish them. It cannot survive without its own sense of threat. The warning here is historical and moral. A polity that cannot imagine safety without coercion will continually manufacture danger. The self-preserving state becomes its own adversary, feeding on the instability it claims to prevent. By 1938-39, the three triads, reinforcement, non-linear expansion, and retrospective normalization, had converged into a single operative structure. The Berlin campus functioned as a living circuit of authority, in which administration, military infrastructure, and security legitimacy co-produced one another. At the system's center stood the Reich Chancellery and the ministries, where decrees and economic plans were drafted. Their work required constant coordination with both the Wehrmacht and the security apparatus. Each policy bore the imprint of military feasibility and police enforcement. Civilian governance no longer existed independently. It was the interface through which the other two powers expressed themselves. The Reich Air Ministry, a vast stone leviathan along Wilhelmstrasse, embodied the operational muscle of the compound. With thousands of rooms and internal courtyards, it housed not only Luftwaffe command, but planning offices, engineers, and logistics experts. The military had become an administrative bureaucracy, the bureaucracy a military command. Binding the two was the RSHA-Gestapo complex. Its dual function, intelligence and repression, gave it control over both information and fear. It legitimized administrative decrees through narratives of threat and translated military failures into calls for unity. In the convergent triad, security became the common language linking all functions. The three nodes formed a self-referential organism. Administration issued orders that required military execution and security justification. Military relied on administration for resources and security for ideological support. Security used the operations of administration and military as proof of its necessity. This closed circuit of dependency was the admino-military compound in full operation, a system whose stability derived not from external legitimacy, but from the impossibility of separating its parts. When administration, military, and security converge, accountability dissolves. Each justifies the other. The bureaucracy claims it enforces military precision. The military insists it executes administrative necessity. The security apparatus validates both through fear. In this triangle, responsibility is everywhere and nowhere. The warning here is structural. Democracy requires separation not merely of powers but of languages. Once every institution speaks the dialect of security, secrecy, efficiency, control. The citizen has no grammar of appeal. The system becomes opaque by design, and opacity is the first refuge of unanswerable authority. Time and again, the regime's spatial and institutional growth followed a recurring pattern. Non-linear expansion initiated control, reinforcement consolidated it. Retrospective normalization sealed it as doctrine. Non-linear expansion began in 1933 with the dislocation of governance, the Reichstag fire, and the move to the Kroll Opera House. What was first a provisional arrangement became the template for ruling from secured environments. The new chancellery and later the bunkers were merely architectural magnifications of this original displacement. Reinforcement followed through the structural penetration of civilian by military and police routines, intensified after 1938, when the purged officer corps and administrative elite merged in a single command language. Retrospective normalization completed the cycle as wartime emergency turned permanent. Air defense regimes, curfews, and the bunkerization of leadership were not temporary defenses, but the mature expression of a system whose justification was itself. By 1944, the compound was both metaphor and reality. The chancellery's subterranean chambers housed the same authority that ruled above ground. The city's ruins mirrored the logic of enclosure. The Führer bunker was not an anomaly, but the terminus of a long architectural argument that began with the decision to meet in a theater under guard. The completed compound appears unassailable, but its strength is illusion. The same interdependence that stabilizes it also ensures its total collapse once any node fails. When legitimacy falters, discipline erodes. When discipline breaks, command dissolves. When command dissolves, the administrative shell implodes. The 3N reversion triad predicts this perfectly. The system cannot fail partially. The Reich collapsed as a unit because its parts had lost independent function. The warning for contemporary systems is structural fragility disguised as coherence. The tighter the integration among security, administration, and legitimacy, the greater the risk that a single breach destroys the whole. What appears as unity may be, in fact, the precondition of total ruin. The militarized campus did not emerge as a single design, nor as the product of a solitary will. It arose through the accumulation of decisions so plausible that each seemed unremarkable when made. Every measure was justified by prudence, a security decree, a spatial relocation, an architectural improvement, a procedural streamlining. Each was a rational response to a perceived necessity. Together, they restructured the very meaning of necessity itself. By the time the new Reich Chancellery opened in 1939, the transformation was complete. The Reich's governing core, a network of ministries, police headquarters, and command centers, had become a single organism. Its geometry embodied a logic: authority as proximity, legitimacy as control, safety as sovereignty. The emergency decree of February 1933 fused the legal and coercive organs of the state. The relocation to the Kroll Opera House redefined deliberation as performance within guarded space. The purges of 1938 erased the last internal opposition to command unification, and the bunkers of 1944 sealed the entire apparatus in concrete, completing the descent from transparency to enclosure. None of these acts appeared radical in isolation. Each carried the same administrative justification: efficiency, protection, coordination. Yet in sequence, they formed an irreversible chain of dependency. Once authority learns to inhabit protection, it forgets how to govern without it. The Nazi administrative campus, stretching from the Chancellery to the Air Ministry and the RSHA, was more than an architectural complex. It was the spatial crystallization of a psychological regime, a diagram of how fear and order conspire to remake governance in their own image. Within this compact geography, administration became indistinguishable from command, and command indistinguishable from surveillance. The city's civic axis, Wilhelmstrasse, once the street of ministries and embassies, turned into a fortified artery of power, each building connected by invisible lines of hierarchy and guarded routine. The physical layout of the capital mirrored the internal circuitry of the regime itself. The deeper lesson is not about Germany alone. Every state, to some degree, builds its own version of this campus, a geography of control that begins with the language of safety and ends in the logic of enclosure. Security perimeters expand, executive compounds multiply, and administrative centers detach from public space. The process feels natural, even inevitable, because it is incremental and bureaucratic rather than violent. Walls rise for protection, not oppression. Access is limited for efficiency, not exclusion. But in time, the geometry of precaution becomes the architecture of separation. What begins as guarded confidence ends as institutional solitude. Seen from this perspective, the compound's formation was emergent, not ordained. The organic consequence of a society that equated danger with disorder and safety with discipline. Its architecture was both symptom and instrument of that belief. The marble galleries, guarded courtyards, and subterranean shelters recorded in stone the moral conversion of governance, from service to survival. Power ceased to be the means of law. It became the art of remaining intact. The physical structures that were meant to secure the regime ultimately sealed it off from reality, ensuring that its collapse, when it came, was total. The warning endures. The modern state, conceived as the guardian of law, is perpetually tempted to become the guardian of itself. When administration, military, and security fuse, when the language of defense replaces the language of accountability, the state ceases to represent the public and begins to preserve its own architecture. The Nazi compound remains the definitive illustration of that danger, a system so perfected in its unity that it could not reform, only fall. Its ruins beneath Berlin are not just remnants of a dictatorship. They are the fossils of an idea. That control can substitute for legitimacy, that fear can sustain order, and that a government can fortify itself into permanence. Nothing collapses more completely than a state that mistakes survival for purpose.